The concentration of ownership of book retailing in the hands of one or two chains, as in Britain and the USA, has been catastrophic for those book industries. The Australian book retail sector, on the other hand, with its strong and varied mix of independents, chains and discount department stores, is regarded as one of the healthiest and most diverse in the world, enabling large volume, large variety and price competition. Yet many independent booksellers believe the ending of territorial copyright will lead to the further closure of independent bookstores, concentrating bookselling further into the hands of the discount department stores owned by Coles and Woolworths and the larger retail chains, which have a record of often charging above the recommended retail price for books and even discriminating actively against small Australian publishers. Australian independent bookstores have for decades supported the unknown Australian writers, built the audience for books for us all. From David Malouf to Christos Tsiolkas, backed the Chloe Hoopers and Joan Londons, reminded us why Helen Garnard mattered and Don Watson was important, persuaded us to buy a first Australian book by a Nam Lee or a Steve Toltz. They are also the path into this country from which books from elsewhere are introduced and keep our book culture from becoming gangrenous, and yet their future under this proposal is bleak indeed. Writers and books that matter will become like an endangered species with no habitat left to support them. The fate of them in the large chain and discount megastore culture will be that of those sorry marsupials spotted in new outer suburbs, dicing with death on freeways, not knowing until that short moment of blinding light dazzle that this is no longer their home. Of course, as the Coalition for Cheaper Books, or as we might more accurately call it, the Coalition for Bigger Business, would point out, that's not the whole story. This is. What is being proposed doesn't exist in Europe or the USA, and even if US and British publishers are allowed to dump books on our market, Australian publishers will not be allowed to do the same in theirs. In the one country in the world where the change was introduced, New Zealand, publishing has, according to the New Zealand Publishers Association, suffered, and books are now more expensive. Bookselling in America, like Australia, runs on a consignment system. Where it differs is that return rates there are typically very high, 50%. These returned unsold books are generally pulped or remaindered, that is, sold off for $1 or $2, the author receiving no payment. Under this proposal, these returned books will now also be able to be dumped on the Australian market like Italian canned tomatoes. Thus, even a hugely successful Tim Winton novel, a book that enables his publisher here, Penguin Australia, to nurture new Australian writers of talent, could end up in Australian remainder bins. A dumped US hardback of Breath would be far cheaper than a comparable Australian paperback, but with no royalty payable to the author and no profit to their Australian publisher. The effects of this would be twofold. It would ultimately force major Australian writers to publish out of the USA to protect their own interests, with all the sorry consequences that would entail, while it would see the destruction of support for the next generation of Tim Wintons as Australian publishers went to the wall or survived as best they could and as they had for the last 2 centuries as distributors for imperial wares made elsewhere for others. It is true that books are made more cheaply in the USA, partly because they pay writers less, where the royalty for an Australian paperback is between 10 and 12.5%. In the US, it is 7.5%. Thus, once Australian writers are compelled to again publish for Australia from New York, they will effectively have taken a 25 to 33% pay cut, a sacrifice for laissez-faire economics that perhaps Bob Carr may wish to publicly emulate. And yet, even after ripping writers off, US book prices are often no cheaper. At the same time, Australian publishing suffers the problem and considerable costs of a small market spread over a huge land. Every major Australian publisher maintains a large sales force, and yet books here are no more expensive. My Dutch publisher, Ambo Anthos, a successful publisher, employs just one sales rep for their small country. And yet come this September, the Dutch paperback of Wanting will go on sale for the equivalent of Australian $36.92. The Coalition for Cheaper Books makes several arguments that are simply untrue. They argue there is no connection between the business of importing and distributing international books and the business of publishing Australian books. If this were true, how do they explain the success of, for example, Australia's most successful independent publisher, Allen & Unwin? A large part of its business comes from overseas titles such as the Harry Potter series, but these profits are ploughed back into its outstanding Australian list, featuring such Australian writers as Andrew McGahn, Christos Tsiolkas and Michelle de Kretser. The Coalition argue there will be a greater diversity of books available under this proposal, but as large publishers believe it will compel them to reduce their Australian lists, as small publishers believe it could push them to the wall, and as independent booksellers believe it will damage their trade and close shops, what will happen is a significant reduction in the diversity of books available to the Australian consumer. Or does Bob Carr think Big W will stock the complete Gore Vidal just for him? For there may be more American celebrity books and dump bestsellers going as red light specials, but that will be it. Given the pricing of overseas books, the practice of large chains and the experience of New Zealand, it is likely that a less competitive retail and publishing environment will generally make books more expensive. And as a nation and a society, we will be back to 40 years ago when we were a colony of the mind, with the money we spend on books going overseas. The Coalition, though, argued that the Australian publishing industry will, quote, continue to grow because it is a dynamic industry driven by local demand. People want to read about their country, its people, its history and its prospects, the Coalition continues. If this were true, why was this demand not met for most of the last 2 centuries when Australians were force-fed a pottage of English books? And the answer is because that's what made money for the big English publisher, as this proposal, as the American publisher noted, will now make money for him. Well, Bob Carr doesn't believe that. On Lateline, in a response to a question about how the ending of national copyright might lead to less Australian writing being published, he said, and I quote, "I've never heard such garbage spoken as this. I've heard a lot of garbage in my time. The fact is Australians will always want to read Australian stories. Can the publishers point to a single title they've put into print as a subsidy for Australian writers? In other words, a title that they know is not going to make a profit, but which they're putting out into the market as a favour to Australian culture." Well, at this point I'd like to share with you one of Australian publishing's odd secrets, something no publisher, I suspect, would say publicly. I've been published in my time by 3 major Australian publishers, Penguin, Pan Macmillan and Random House, all subsidiaries of international companies, yet each fiercely proud and supportive of their Australian writers. And in every company, every year, there were Australian books that were published that everyone knew in that company knew would not make money. And they were published because those publishers believed that this Australian book mattered, that this Australian writer mattered, that this Australian story should be heard, that these Australian poems, these Australian essays, this Australian novel should be read. But they didn't do it as a favour to Australian culture, or even to the writer, or to anyone or anything. They did it because they intuitively understood that their role was not just making money, necessary as that was. Because as well as being a business, every Australian publishing house I know of sees itself as inextricably part of Australian culture. Publishing companies are not millionaires' factories for everyone involved. And Australian culture is not an abstract term for them. It is what they do. It is who they are. And despite what some in the chain book retailers think, the Australian book industry is not yet a war zone. It is, for the most part, a series of collaborations and partnerships and friendships. I'm not pretending that there aren't differences or battles, that it isn't competitive, that tough business isn't sometimes done. But my experience is that the industry is most successful when writer works with publisher and publishers with booksellers in all their forms to sell books. My experience is that there are many good people at every level and in every size and aspect of the book business who believe in books as something more than mere product. One might think if the federal government were truly serious about creating free trade, if they really wanted a level playing field, they would either take the GST off books sold in Australia or oblige Amazon to charge it at source, as Amazon does for other countries and several US states to which it ships. Taking GST off books ought to be seriously considered as an economic stimulus that would create jobs, stimulate sales and act as a considerable fillip to our literary culture. If the Coalition for Cheaper Books are genuine about Australians having cheaper books, they would come out and back one of these two alternatives. But that won't happen, because it isn't about cheaper books at all. It is the final sorry issue of big end-of-town greed coupling with starry-eyed free trade ideologues in government who know nothing of the market, believe in its genius only working when fully unfettered. That same combination, in other words, of corporate greed and political naivety that has given us the greatest economic crisis since the Depression. Kevin Rudd has famously declared that the great neoliberal experiment of the past 30 years has failed, going on to say that, ironically, it falls to social democracy to prevent liberal capitalism from cannibalising itself. But does he mean any of it? For it falls to Kevin Rudd to explain exactly why his government is now seriously contemplating exactly that sort of cannibalism that he so publicly railed against. And if his government sanctions this proposal, it will fall to Kevin Rudd to explain not just to Australia, but to the world, what sort of nation he wishes to lead that would seek to destroy rather than support and develop its writing culture. For what nation can advance with its tongue torn out? Maybe this proposal will benefit its sponsors, Dymocks and Coles and Woolworth, but it will not the Australian people. They will pay more for books made elsewhere in the image of others. There will be less Australian books. There will be a slow dieback of Australian literature that will be as sad in its way as the dying of the Murray or the Great Barrier Reef. There will be less jobs in publishing, bookselling and printing, something else Kevin Rudd and his economic ministers claim to be concerned about. And for those Australian writers who do not do what they had to do for the best part of 2 centuries, leave for exile in the US and Europe, there will be less chance of surviving in a country that perhaps values its writers and book culture less than any other in the Western world. That for a short time Australian book culture had been one of the more inventive, vibrant and exciting literatures in the world will be the cause for wistful wonder rather than the foundation of a dream of a different country we might have been. And for that we'll be able to thank Bob Carr and his mates and think of how only Bernie Madoff got away with selling a bigger fantasy. For this reason, there is at the heart of this battle a great sadness. There is a new Philistinism abroad. The cold contempt which this measure reveals some in power to have for a creative community that has done so much for this country is despicable. It is therefore not enough that we defeat this pernicious job, wealth and culture destroying proposal, because unless we propose something better, something worse will eventuate. An Australian writing faces a future defined not by its achievements, but by the interests of the rauters and the racketeers, those who fleece and fly. Would be taking the fall again and again for the promoters that Mad Dog Kemp always warned the family about. I began speaking about the battle 6 centuries ago to have the Bible published in the language of the people, and I spoke of the right, our right, to our own voice, which was also historically that battle between truth and power. And once more, that battle to want to know stories that matter in your own idiom flies in the face of a dominant orthodoxy, this time a theology of the abacus rather than that of the cross. We can prostrate ourselves to that abacus, tear out our tongues and end up as a banging gong, a clanging cymbal. Or we can with love seize our language, our stories, and with them make ourselves anew. Because none of this would just be a reflection of who we are, but a reinvention of ourselves that never ends. And that is the great and historic possibility that now presents itself to Kevin Rudd, a possibility that allows his government to show that it is not just one more empty vessel, that it is brave and that it is visionary, and that it wishes to build on our strengths and our creative talents to make Australian literature one of the world's great literatures of the 21st century. For Kevin Rudd can do more than just reject the measure to end territorial copyright. He can turn around, recognise the centrality of Australian writing to Australia, and offer something large and positive. He could make explicit national support for Australian stories told in Australian voices. Is this too much? I think not. It is, after all, exactly what Canada has for its writers and has had for many years. And then, building on that clarity, create a raft of measures, programs, laws and institutions, all with the purpose of supporting Australian writers telling Australian stories. We could, for example, have a National Book Commission charged with developing the book industry that takes over the grant work of the Australia Council's poorly financed Literature Board and is given a much broader and larger role. It should, on a large scale, instigate well-funded, comprehensive measures that aid and develop small publishers, that assist in book distribution, maintain retail diversity, that build professional standards and develop book culture, that fosters exports and creates international attention, that ensures Australian literature becomes a central rather than peripheral part of our humanities teaching, that ensures Australian writing benefits rather than suffers from the new technologies. For the last quarter of a century, we had a politics, an economy and a society that had as their central dreaming a fiction, a certain idea of life as being reduced to a free market. I say fiction pointedly. We are, after all, a species defined above all other things, by above all other things, our capacity for reflecting, divining and creating anew our world through story. The free market was a cocaine rush of a story, a blast of confidence and belief that fortuitously coincided with the collapse of a rival utopian tale, communism. It gave unprecedented economic growth to the world. But at the beginning of this millennium, it has become apparent that it is also running out of time, that it has led us also to epidemics of depression, to ceaseless unwinnable wars, to an economic malaise and environmental despair. Today, more people live in poverty than any time in human history. Today, the land and sea are under assault from a climate system stressed and unstable. We need new stories. We need the capacity to make those stories. And to do that, we need to come together. But as in Tyndale's time, we will need to stand up and fight for such things to happen, for the ongoing right to hear our stories in our own voice. And in time, I hope we in Australia may even find our own words as remarkable as those words beautiful and atonement. New words that not just describe, but create a new country coming into being. An idea for our language in the shape of these words and the worlds that come forth from them. Words and worlds, it remains our shared possibility to make and our future glory to know. Thank you for listening to me tonight.